go ahead and get started. And not to belabor the point too much, right? These are attendance quizzes. So I'm checking if you're physically here, also if you've been sort of mentally here. They're really meant just to be just a quick snapshot of where we are as a class. And if you find the quizzes too easy, that's not a problem. You don't have to complain if that's the case. But if you are finding that as you're working on a quiz, you just really don't even understand the tenor or the nature of the questions, that's a sign that maybe take some time this week and review the lecture notes, review the corresponding materials in the associated textbook for this class. And then I think you'll feel a little bit more comfortable going forward. I haven't gotten that feeling from anyone on an individual level that you're lost or just getting by in this class. But sometimes I don't really see that until it's gotten a little too late. Next week is our more somewhat significant checkpoint. That's our macro quiz alpha. These quizzes have all been 5 questions. Take it 50 times if you need to, but hopefully you don't need to take it 50 times. That is, I think it's 12 questions next week, and it's take it just a single time. So we'll give you more time for that. But then at that point, it's not really guessing anymore. It's like, I should know this material, and it's really just going to cover everything up through what we get to today. Very similar nature of questions. It's not long form, deep essay questions. It's very similar multiple choice, fill in the blank type of questions. But at this point, we're taking those snapshots, and I just want to see where you're at as a class, and also then as on an individual level. It's still relatively modest in terms of the overall contribution to your final grade. But it's important to keep track of where you are, and you'll know that after next Thursday, I think. We'll continue on to where we left off. We were looking at CVS, CWE, CVE, CWE, CVSS, and the like. Another thing that Mitra is responsible for is CAPEC, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Although looking at the different domains of attacks here, and we'll eventually talk more about social engineering, it occurred to me while we were sort of proctoring this quiz here is that laptop stickers, which I normally am not staring at, but I was staring at for the last 5 minutes, are a really nice kind of entry point for social engineering in terms of just leaking personal information about yourself. Anyone in the class from Kansas City? Possibly. Anyone from California in the class? Possibly. No? Okay. All right. All right. Potential enjoying the outdoors? Yes, possibly. Beta, theta, pi members in the classroom? Okay, I'm just saying. It is a little surprising, and the others are a little too subtle or just too far away for me to say too much about. That's kind of interesting. I guess that you want to kind of express your individuality, or just be able to keep track of which laptop is yours when it's in a big room full of other people. But it's also kind of leaking a little bit of information about yourselves as well. But that's good. For me, it's a chance to get to know you a little bit better in terms of how you like to express yourself, or just what stickers you've acquired over the years. It may, in fact, not mean anything. Like the California sticker apparently does not mean any connection to California. So you got me there. That's a good way to kind of hide your identity effectively there. Okay, so jumping back into this topic, which is Mitra and all the things they support, kind of the alphabet soup of different ways of really trying to apply a slightly more formal methodology to what is otherwise kind of an ad hoc, more art than science, right? Which is breaking down the different nature of vulnerabilities, why they exist. And in terms of that, CAPEC's basic goal is to attempt to really classify all the different attack patterns and attack methodologies. There's not a single thing within CAPEC that I think if you were to read it would not be sort of immediately obvious to you, even at this point in kind of your study of this field. But it provides a much more formal way of kind of answering the question of an attacker has accomplished something, and for whatever that something is, and we'll look at just a random example here in just a second. It tries to kind of trace backwards as well as forward from that point. An attacker has accomplished something. Looking backwards, by what mechanisms could they have gotten to that point? Could they have exploited a vulnerable service? For any individual vulnerability, one should be able to do that themselves and be able to come up with an answer. But more broadly speaking, it allows you to more formally say, okay, here's how this service could have been exploited. And again, you'll see there's nothing new there, but it's just a more kind of rigorous way of laying out all the possibilities. And then also looking forward from that point. This attacker exploited this particular vulnerable service. What is the expectation for what they may be capable of doing next? So when I say it's obvious on an individual level, but it's still useful in kind of a global scale. sort of emulating sort of the attacker's perspective, what kind of methods could have been in use or may then still be in use going forward from that point. Let me open it up here. Just this is one of the very many different KPEC listings. This is KPEC 561, Windows admin shares with stolen credentials. And again, this is fine. We know that this is a possibility that if someone uh, gains access to administrative credentials, they may then have subsequent access to so-called hidden shares, administrative shares that allow people to access by design otherwise not globally accessible file systems and other shared resources on a particular system there. So the question is, what do we do with that information? If we assume someone has admin shares with stolen credentials, we go backwards and we say, well, by what mechanism did they acquire those stolen credentials? And those are all, if we think of it as sort of a tree data structure, those are all the can follow listings here. How did we get to that point is what can follow is attempting to answer. It really provides you no exact guarantee that any of these things necessarily happened, but it's how did we get to a point of having stolen administrative credentials? Perhaps it was vulnerable to a dictionary-based password attack or via some brute forcing, or maybe it was a sticker on the back of a laptop that had your administrative password on it, or via all sorts of other kind of authentication bypassing mechanisms that we're really going to start jumping into next week. And then can proceed, meaning what can happen next? What can we do now that we have that access? Well, all sorts of things, be frank. So to start with, file manipulation. Again, on an individual basis, that's sort of obvious. I have administrative credentials. I can then manipulate files that are provided access via those administrative credentials. But then from that point, we can continue to go from there as well and figure out what other attacks may be possible, kind of daisy chaining those particular vulnerabilities and attack methods that are being used. That's really all we need to, I think, know about KPEC. It's just a way of emulating the attacker's perspective by providing this classification of all the different really known attack patterns and methodologies, classified by both the general high-level domains or types of attacks, as well as the actual mechanisms by which these exploits are being carried out. We can bring up the actual page for the domains of attack. I think it's kind of interesting here. They break it down into more things than what we have been looking at as a class so far. I think it's very natural to focus primarily on either software vulnerabilities or communications vulnerabilities. And of course, they're both pretty closely related to each other. And we'll continue to do so. So I'm not saying it's not relevant or important to look at those things. But there is much more in the world, much more capability than just trying to take advantage of vulnerabilities in software applications. First off, while some of you may have less or more experience and background in this area than others, but what can we do with potentially vulnerable hardware? We oftentimes don't think of hardware as having vulnerabilities, but hardware is something that's designed corresponding to a specification and designed by flawed people and has flaws in implementations. And while it's oftentimes not the case that a hardware vulnerability is as remotely exploitable or is kind of straightforward to understand the particular bug that went into it, it is also the case that there's all sorts of different hardware attacks that are possible versus just software attacks. We'll also talk a little bit just now to start with so-called supply chain attacks that can be both software supply chain as well as hardware supply chain. Historically, it would have referred to primarily as hardware supply chain, meaning I'm building a server, I have to acquire the various components for this server or just purchase the server. How much trust do I have in that particular process? But now today, when we look at modern software development in which we are seemingly writing less and less just code from starting from zero and more just about integrating existing functions and libraries and existing frameworks. And the code we write is just gluing those various things together in novel and interesting ways. We have corresponding supply chain concerns as well. To what extent am I able to trust this particular third-party software that I'm using in this project? Am I auditing it? Am I really understanding what's happening there? And we'll talk more about social engineering as well as physical security a little later on in the semester as well. But of these, just to kind of bring this up as something that KPEC highlights as kind of a first-class citizen with software and hardware and social engineering and physical security, I think supply chain security is a little interesting. And I thought we could do, and let's take no more than about 5 minutes with this. I provided a few links here to what I thought was at least personally, kind of a fascinating story. There has been another very fascinating, very relevant supply chain story that came out this week, but that one's a little too hot for us to discuss. So this one is from 5 years ago, something that we can discuss. And funny thing about it is we really still don't know the answer to this particular story. Um, so these links are all available on the slides. If you go to Canvas, you may have to re-download it. I realized one of the links was broken this morning, so I actually just repaired it this morning. And this is the so-called supermicro supply chain hack story. Has anyone heard about this before? It was a big deal in certain communities at a certain point in time. And I'd like you to take just no more than, let's say, 5 minutes. Navigate to Canvas, take a read, perhaps with the person next to you. You don't all have to grab the story individually. And I want to just discuss amongst ourselves. Because to me, it's not necessarily a whodunit story. There's pretty clear theories as to the actual supply chain itself that was been violated. But I wanted to get your personal take, because there's a story. There is as clear of a refutation of the story as you'll ever see in sort of national security news cycles, and then follow-ups in the story that claims, yes, no, in fact, this actually did happen. Let's take 5 minutes. Let's discuss our thoughts as to what do we think? Because the actual truth of the answer is not really something that we have privilege of actually knowing. Based on just reading the stories, what's our perspective on it? Let's take 5 minutes. I would click on that first link as well as really any of those follow-up links, and let's read through it and kind of discuss with the people around us today. So what do we think? And again, there's no correct answer here necessarily, right? We have a story that has a decent amount of technical detail in it, indicating that there's this particular chip that was not part of the board's original specification. Engineers discovered it, and they believed that when the server was installed and switched on, the microchip altered the operating system's core, which is not a really technical term here, but altered the operating system so it could accept modifications. So basically installed a software rootkit via this kind of custom little processor. Why is there reason for skepticism? Well, these things are kind of inherently political in nature too, right? So there's a claim that such a thing happened. Every single other person involved in the story denied that it happened, but they could have denied for all sorts of reasons, including, National Security Agency denied it, Apple denied it, other people denied it as well. Supermicro, of course, denied it, and to this day, people are still using Supermicro to source all sorts of servers. That sounds pretty convincing. I said I don't know. What do you guys think? Any opinion after reading this story? Is it possible? Absolutely, right? I mean, what is described here? Um, Tiny little microchip that could look as small as a signal conditioning coupler. You can certainly fit a microprocessor in something that size these days. Maybe 15 years ago, that would have been an issue, but today that is definitely not an issue. You can fit a microprocessor in something that size. Where would that microprocessor have to be installed to really be able to intercept things like operating system calls and network access? That part seems a little bit trickier to me. Um, we do know that there's significant concerns about supply chain attacks. So it's not just Supermicro. Huawei is the other real big one where the concern was that, well, they are manufacturing a large amount of 5G and related equipment that's used all over the United States, and we don't necessarily trust any of the hardware that they're making. So that is more, people believe it's sort of a design supply chain attack versus this kind of subversive one that they have here in the Supermicro case. So it's certainly possible. As I read these stories and look at them and the skepticism that's provided in some of the sort of response articles to them, the one claim that I think is the one that probably wins the day is so many thousands of servers were exploited. It had these backdoors built into them. Where are the chips? That would be what I would want to see. If someone can say, here is this server, popped off the chip, put it under an X-ray, or delayered it and discover what was actually inside it. If someone would show that to me and I could see that picture, which of course could be very much like a national security secret at this point, but if there was a photo of such a thing, I'd feel a lot more confident that the attack actually happened, because it was supposedly in thousands of servers and thousands of people would then have access to it. But as we've seen, not just from this story, but also more recent stories, even this week, such things are possible, right? inserting yourself into the supply chain, literally going from design to components to integration to final product. People can insert themselves, at least nation state sized actors can insert themselves into that process and do things like mess with the hardware software supply chain life cycle. So that's just something that KPEC highlights that we otherwise don't talk a little bit much about in this class. I thought I would bring that up, and we can post other articles and discuss other articles about this as well. In these slides, I do try to provide a bunch of links as we go, and we don't always click on them. We don't always have time to read them. They're really just meant for kind of additional, flavor to the material that would otherwise just be very kind of dry textbook material. So that's my hope. When you see a link, take note of it, click it later, review it after class, gain a little bit more context for what we're talking about, which is otherwise just kind of in theory, what it really means in practice. Mitra also maintains the attack matrix, adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. That is another knowledge base that attempts to really just model all the techniques and adversarial behavior used to attack organizations. It is also trying to represent the real world scenarios of the how, why, as well as what's next for attackers' behavior. It is just one attack matrix. Really, what we are learning in this semester's kind of ethical hacking slash pen testing methodology is a version of this, just a less detailed version of this. But if you look at it, it should all look kind of vaguely familiar. Doesn't look that great on the slide in front of you, but I think I have it here. That is the attack matrix for enterprise. And well, it's not exactly what we are covering here, but what does it start with? It does start with reconnaissance, right? Which we've already covered. We can click on it and get a feel for, what does it mean to gather victim host information, and talks about all kind of the pre-attack things that can happen, what kind of scans it would be performed and things like that. Also talks about, both initial access as well as executing the actual system hacking stage of things. We can click on a couple of things, or at least one thing here, to get a feel for the kind of things that they are referring to in the attack matrix. We can look at initial access via external remote services, kind of another way of phrasing our enumeration and vulnerability searching approach that we do in this class. And the idea is that if there is some external facing remote service, an adversary can leverage that to gain access and or persist within a network. And then there's all sorts of examples, not exactly of CVEs that are associated with this, because that's what's already provided in the CVE listing, as well as in the KPEC breakdown. But in this case, also well-known, advanced persistent threats and other well-known actual real-world published attacks in terms of how attackers gained access to various things. Let's pick on something that's not too terribly controversial here. Um, okay, Linux Rabbit is fine. So an attack that was just looking at unsecured, improperly configured SSH servers and IoT devices, and then that created basically a botnet via very straightforward kind of password cracking on those particular devices. So as you look at the attack matrix, again, it should look vaguely familiar in terms of what it is covering. And you can actually then directly correlate it to real world attacks that have happened. Again, just like with KPEC, it's nothing new in the sense of there's not some new technical concept here that we're not already covered in class, but it goes into a little bit more depth than the approach that we are covering in this class, and also links to some very real world, also some of them somewhat controversial attacks that have been carried out and what mechanisms were used via those attacks. So this topic was called system hacking, and I mentioned on Tuesday that it's not a great title. We could have called it exploiting vulnerabilities would have been a valid title for this. It's really what do we do after we have done our scanning and enumeration and have some reason to believe that there is a host running particular services that may or may not be vulnerable to attack. So the CVE databases that we were starting with, they do provide some relevant background, give you some leads to follow, but they don't actually tell you by design that what should an attacker do with this. We have been looking at things like Nmap scripting engine, and you did that in lab 2, which for the most part, those scripts are there to kind of provide you that sort of binary result of is vulnerable, is not vulnerable. But as part of that, they are also doing small proof of concepts. There were some other databases we looked at for this as well, but then there's these particular tools whose purpose is really to take it to that next step, which is not just to now do service scanning, but to really do vulnerability scanning. Again, we did a little bit of that with Nmap scripting engine, but there it's much more kind of user driven. Is my Apache server vulnerable to this particular vulnerability? Let me run this particular script to check if that is the case. Now, these other tools are trying to be a bit more comprehensive than that. This is for my IP address or IP address ranges, ports, as well as known services. Correlate what you can find to the known list of vulnerabilities that have current exploits associated with them. So that's what you're doing now in lab 3, a little bit more of the scripting engine, but now you're using things like you're using Nessus, and seems like a sufficiently good tool to me. This is another area where there's strong opinions and people will swear by Burp Suite. There's a trade-off also here between cost and effectiveness of the particular tools. For our academic use case for SIBE 2310, the class you're in right now, Nessus seems perfectly valid, and there's nothing wrong with us using it in lab today. We have the free one with our educational, and it's already installed for us. This is a somewhat consensus opinion that Nmap, while it does do vulnerability scanning, isn't really built for that first and foremost. It is built to take advantage of all the real subtle things with TCP/IP implementations to do really effective port scanning, but everything is kind of user supplied to do anything beyond that. And so these other tools, which are not free but are very effective, are considered a better approach for this next step of vulnerability scanning. And many of you, that says lab 2 here, but many of you have already gone through this part and completed this part, right? Which is for your own IP address ranges. And did people see a chart that looked something like this already? Okay. My main concern is when there's an instruction in the lab and you successfully run the instruction in the lab and gather the screenshot and do what you needed to do. My main concern for you is, did it mean anything to you, right? I mean, you've shown that you can copy paste a command or faithfully recreate a command by typing it in character by character. But I think what's important, and where I want you to pause when you're in the lab, is when you run a command. I want you to at least ask yourself the question of, okay, what did I actually do? And sometimes the topics don't line up perfectly. Like we'll get to this several days after when you actually did this in lab, so I understand that as well. But that's the whole point of this learning experience, because otherwise you really won't have learned much in that process. You'll learn how to follow instructions. But something I'll mention in just a minute here is the lab environment that we have set up for you for the previous course, for this class, as well as subsequent classes, is intentionally crafted so that the commands we provide for you work and get you from A to B to C and get you through the attack methodology. That is by design. There are more open-ended experiences. You have the option to kind of experiment with both kind of co-curricular, extracurricular, that don't give you as much of a hand-holding. But even in those scenarios, the expectation is there's a reasonable path for you to follow. The real world won't be like that, right? There may be some common trends that will still be valid once you leave the lab environment and go out and do this in practice, but it will definitely not be as straightforward as, run this command, now run this command, now run this command. We have to be able to appreciate, we have to understand each step we're applying here, and sometimes that involves, asking questions of what is some of this technical jargon that these particular tools are spitting out back at me. And if you read them and you understand exactly what's happening, that's fine. But I do want you to just take a pause. The labs aren't that hard, right? They're not that time consuming. They're not that hard. So you have time to kind of pause and digest. Maybe after it's all done, maybe you get your full score for the lab and then you go back and look at what you did again and try to understand what each step was actually accomplishing. But in this case, we run a Nessus scan in the lab. It tells us that for these particular IP addresses, here is the correlated vulnerabilities associated with them, from critical all the way down to just kind of informational thing. And it will tell you, like, for this particular IP address that it scanned, here is a very well-known critical CVE that it could be susceptible to. And this is meant to connect to everything we've been learning in this topic, right? There's a CVE. It has a particular VSS score, and we were looking at 4.0, but it's really very similar for 3.0, where that looks like nonsense, but we saw that it was just kind of a spreadsheet that tells us exactly the nature of the vulnerability, what access an attacker would need to have to exploit the vulnerability, and what kind of impact that vulnerability would have here. And that's our next step, right? So we already, via Nmap and other things, had some knowledge about where to look next. We should have already known, um, and I forget which of these it actually is, if it's 102 or 106, that there's a web server running Linux on one of these particular machines in our subnet. We then have enough information to kind of dig deeper. Otherwise, you really can't be just spamming. Just like we don't really want to do that with Nmap either. You really shouldn't be just kind of spamming Nessus scans across the internet writ large. They tend to be. We talk about the noisiness of a scan, and that was a bit more hand wavy when talking about Nmap because you'd have to really look at sort of a Wireshark log to get a better feel for what's happening with an Nmap scan. But here, for doing a Nessus scan, it is explicitly trying to not exploit machines, but directly probe those machines, not just at the network level, but now at the application level, and to try to figure out what are they running, what versions do they have. It is attempting to automate a lot of kind of the manual methodology you were doing for lab number 2 going into lab number 3. And this is about 10 identifiable log entries per minute. That is just in your particular lab setup. And these kind of log entries, and again, not all log entries are equally relevant, but these are all kind of alarm bell log entries that get generated by this tool. Meaning that if there is any kind of network intrusion detection, intrusion prevention system, even some advanced firewalls, they would be able to tell you that your system is currently being very deeply probed, and you need to be aware that that is happening. Again, that's the trade-off between kind of effectiveness of a tool as well as the relative stealthiness of a tool. But in this case, it's also, whether we are just blindly using a tool and saying just attack or scan everything, probe everything, enumerate everything, versus via a more careful methodological approach, getting partial information about a resulting host, system, network, service, and then again, more carefully kind of digging deeper and seeing what we can discover about a particular machine. Vulnerability scanners are pretty effective, though, having said all that, right? You give it an IP address or range, you wait a reasonable amount of time depending on the scope of what your scan is requesting, and it gives you this kind of wonderful chart of everything red is in big trouble, effectively, is what that chart is telling you back. One countermeasure is just on the more protective side of things is these tools exist. They're not limited to people attempting to actually exploit things to use them yourself. Run them on a periodic basis yourself to identify, just like we were doing with Nmap, to identify what hosts we didn't realize were up or actually up, or what services are open that we didn't think were open. Run this to determine what vulnerable services we have that we may not realize we had. If you're running any kind of intrusion detection, intrusion protection system, there are then ways to both kind of just alert when these things are detected, or potentially if it's an intrusion protection system, to kind of slow down that process. That is a little bit of a cat and mouse game, right? It can detect this nature of log traffic and determine that it's not going to allow at a certain rate that traffic to continue. I guess, and I put that as a question mark in the hope that if it's slow, the attacker will get frustrated and leave. But again, we talk about this in the context of Nmap scanning. These logs are created because of the scans, but these scans are possible because these hosts are running legitimate services, presumably, right? And so turning it off, unplugging the cable isn't usually an option. I guess that's the assumption, right? That we have the system, we have a service because it's needed for some particular purpose. So unplugging it's not generally an option. And so the whole idea of slowing that scanner traffic to a crawl may or may not work, because ultimately the whole point is to have that service be available in the first place. And then certainly by running those reports, by running those scans, you're generating some sort of report telling you, here's everything that you have available and open from this particular entry point. And you have to make those decisions. How many of those do I actually need here? Other uses of vulnerability scanning, it's effectively required now for PCI compliance that if you are an organization that is handling payment data, credit card data, that you have to have various internal and external network scans as part of that compliance. Um, that's also partially why there's relatively very few players in this field, given the relatively high stakes associated with supporting that compliance. So at least on a quarterly basis or after any significant change in your network, there has to be some sort of this type of scan that is performed with serious penalties, although serious being a relative thing when companies that process credit information screw this up. And the truth is they often do. So there's a little bit of a cause and effect being a little bit backwards here, but you don't have to go very far back at all to see these kind of major credit card processing concerns. And for honestly, for things that would have been caught with what is considered now best practices for auditing your own network infrastructure. So there's a good article I've posted here that we will not read today, but you can certainly look at later, which is analysis of the Target data breach in 2013. The link I had looked at said that Target paid $20 million in settlement. I don't recall getting any of that, but I don't know. Maybe it was a quarter or something that came to me as an individual user. This is kind of nice. This is kind of a government report. So this is not just an ad hoc kind of report here that talks about what happened and how people gained access. It almost reads like science fiction, just the very broad strokes of what happened and how all that information was lost about all the Target customers. Target gave network access to a small Pennsylvania HVAC company, so someone handling the heating, ventilation, air conditioning. Um, and that was the actual entry point for attackers. They actually were running all sorts of intrusion protection systems on their software and just sort of ignored the alerts and the warnings that those were provided. And the actual infiltration point was on the actual point of sale machines. It says it here somewhere, where the point of sale software itself had malware installed on it, which was able to propagate to all of their actual, we can call them checkout machines or point of sale machines that they had there. So that all that data was able to be scraped, and they had to pay what seems to me to be a pretty modest penalty associated with that. Adobe also, although we don't necessarily think of Adobe as a credit card processor, they are. You can purchase software directly from Adobe, got off relatively easy. If you ever purchase anything from Warner Music Group, your credit card information was also very likely hacked. And the real big one was the Equifax breach, which basically exposed lots of personally identifying information about every adult in America. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Equifax breach later on in this semester. I also don't recall getting any of the $300 million either, which seems like a large enough number that I would have seen some of it. I think it was free credit monitoring was part of that thing that they provided, which is great. I want to make sure we know what we're doing in lab, as I mentioned, right? And not just typing in commands, although that's fine as well. We are using Kali Linux in our lab. And I just think this is just more personal perspective. And I asked this on day one or the first quiz, the first week of the semester, is what was everyone's level of personal comfort with Linux? The answers, if you don't mind me sharing it, were actually pretty high. On a scale of 1 to 10, I asked your personal comfort level with using Linux and separately with Windows. I think the average was like an 8 out of 10. And I've been using Linux and using old school Unix well before that. I don't know if I'm at an 8 or 8 out of 10 yet, personally. So maybe this is not a necessary point to make, but it's a very important survival skill to learn in this field in general. So while you go into the lab and you're required to kind of type in the same 12 commands that everybody else in lab is also going to be doing, um, when you type in a command and it doesn't make sense to you, but it works, okay, get your screenshot, write up your write up, fine, get your points. All that, I'm perfectly okay with all that, but I don't want you doing it just blindly. So there aren't any truly magic commands we're doing this semester in the lab. So you have time. I think you should have the bandwidth to say, okay, this is something I haven't done before in Linux. What exactly is this command doing? And by the way, feel free to ask as well. Feel free to post. Feel free to ask your TA. Sometimes those things are a little bit harder than others to Google and get a really clear, precise response. And it's a little boring to learn Linux from like very base principles, although we do have classes that provide that as well. But But Kali Linux is pretty cool. It's really just a Debian-based Linux distribution that provides a lot of the tools we would otherwise want to install anyway. Um, it's a good survival skill to learn it. It's also really nice just to see what is already provided on this. There are other Kali-like competitors, but there's nothing wrong with this. So this is what we choose for this class. And this, if you look at their website and look at the actual tools they have provided, you get a feel for all the things that they actually provide with that distribution. And that's what it's for. It's really there for those who, I would think a conceptual breakdown would be better than the alphabetical one here. All the different things that are provided, we use maybe 5% of these tools this semester. So I think that's cool. That's an opportunity. You have this nice, safe environment. You really can't break too much this semester if you stay within our environment that we provide for you. And if you break it, we can fix it very quickly. So feel free to explore as well. Again, get your lab done, do what's necessary to get a complete grade on these labs. Then start to really make sure you gain that next level of understanding, because I think that's pretty important. So, for example, and we'll leave this to next week when we talk about Metasploit and what it's actually doing. I think that's a real risk so far this semester with the way the labs are currently presented to you, that you will use Metasploit to actually launch pre-written exploit modules. That's fine, but the way it's written, I think you can do it without having any understanding of what's actually happening under the hood. And I don't want the technology to be magic for you any further, right? I don't want Linux to feel like magic for you. I don't want the commands to feel like they're just magic incantations for you. You're at a point in your academic careers where let's make sure we actually understand what we're doing. Because again, we put that effort into making sure that when we put Lab 3, Lab 4, Lab 5 together, by and large, every command is supposed to work, by and large. That's only going to be for this class. And when you get out of this Iowa State environment and when you actually have to have some real pen testing experience, sure, there'll be mentorship and you'll get, you won't be just thrown to it from nothing, but you have to have an understanding for why you were doing the steps you were doing, what other options were available, because it won't be as clear as attack box.102 in your real world context that you'll have. Let's leave things here for today. We can finish this up on Tuesday. Otherwise, I want everyone to have a tremendous day and enjoy your weekends.